I want to talk today about transcreation with you guys because this is something that we focus a lot on generally. As Fabian said, we started off copywriting and we've moved into translation, and actually marketing and transcreation is something that we put a lot of focus on, and especially in the US. So I thought this is maybe an interesting topic for you guys, and yeah. So as you see, this is quite silly, but it's a really good example of a tricky headline. It's 11 words, and it will probably take you half a day to come up with something really similar in your own language. And by similar, I mean it should contain the original style, the intent, and something that kind of makes people smile in the same way. So it might not be the same words, but something with a similar message. And this is kind of a really typical example of transcreation. So using this as an example, I just want to see if we could talk today about what makes a translator a great transcreator, and if transcreation is a skill that you can learn or improve on, and how that can work. And then finally, maybe you've worked on some transcreation projects for Supertext, but we'll talk about how that process deviates a little bit from the process of translation. So you may have noticed transcreation is a bit of a buzzword now. So we talk a lot about it when we talk to clients, and I think it's a trend that we see continuing. You've kind of probably seen the opposite end, where the language industry is becoming more and more automated. There's a lot of machine translation coming in, AI and all these buzzwords. And the flip side, I think, of that is that people are really looking for quality translations and really creative transcreations. So we're talking about localization to a point where it really feels like something was written in the native language. And one of the trends, though, with that is that transcreation has become something that people sell, I guess, or people do as sort of an extension of translation. So it's a little bit more creative, or a little bit more, just a little bit better, or maybe just more expensive. Yeah, and then a lot of people think, you know, if you pay more, you'll get more. And that kind of isn't quite the essence of what transcreation is, because actually transcreation, we should really be focusing on the creation part of the word. And the goal of transcreation should be to make an emotional impact with the reader. You need to know the market really well. You need to get inside the head of the readers, and you need to be able to write copy that they respond to. And so actually transcreation has a lot more to do with marketing than it does with translation. You'll probably come across a lot of projects where you have a source text, and that should be kind of like your brief. It should just tell you what you need to include in terms of information, who the target audience is maybe, a little bit more about the message and the tone, and that should just be like a basis of what you create in your own language. And you should really be kind of be free to write as you think suits your language the best. And so we're talking about content like slogans, taglines, ad campaigns, maybe apps and websites. It's a lot of content that includes like wordplay or product names or maybe titles, and usually some kind of pun or something that's tricky. And if you think about a marketing team that came up with this content, they probably spent hours or weeks or even months on it, and they got it really to a point where it works in that language. And I think that it deserves the same amount of attention when you're localizing it into other languages. So just looking at a really familiar example, this is an example that comes up a lot, but it's McDonald's slogan, I'm loving it. I think in German it's just Ich liebe es, which is pretty straightforward. And I think in different countries, you can probably think about your own country, what that was. I think in Japanese, it's actually, I'm loving it, but they say it in a Japanese accent. And so, yeah, so it's a really good example of how transcreation could actually mean different things. It can mean that you do a direct translation because it works. It can mean you leave it in your own language because that works, or change it a little bit. And McDonald's also transcreates its own product names. So if you've watched Pulp Fiction, you'll remember that scene where they talk about the Quarter Pounder and how it's called a Royale with cheese in France. So that's a really typical example. And so this is something that we do. It's a process that we connect to copywriting, which is it's actually in our roots, the copywriting side. And we really think about who would be good for a project to transcreate things like this. So we want to talk a little bit today about the difference between translators and copywriters, because I think that's a good way to go into who a good transcreator is. So, translators translate. You're probably very highly educated. It's something that you've studied for years. Most translators have a master or bachelor degree, and they're really interested in foreign languages. They want to learn the foreign language to understand the language better, and also because they just have a passion for it. Translators have a lot of tools, so you probably work with this. CAT tools are essential for a translator, and you might have to work with multiple systems, TMS systems, translation memories, editors, depending on what your client demands of you. And technology is actually something that really helps your work. It makes you more consistent, you translate faster, and so you're probably a very tech-savvy person. Copywriters, on the other hand, they focus really on the writing. They don't really work with CAT tools or Trados. They don't usually speak a second language. And when they sit down to work, they start with a blank sheet, right? Because their job is to find a really great idea. It might be a blog post or copy or website landing page, maybe an ad for Instagram or Facebook. But their mission is to find a great idea and tell a story. They then choose their words really wisely, and they try and hone the message, and they really care about the narrative. Essentially, copywriters are salesmen, so they are selling an idea or a product or whatever it is, but they need to come up with ideas. So I think this slide kind of really shows the differences between translators and copywriters. And ultimately, translators start with one language and transfer that to the next, and copywriters start from scratch. So taking this into consideration, who are transcreators? Transcreators are kind of like unicorns, right? They're very, very rare. They understand marketing very well. They understand their own markets. And they understand writing, just like copywriters do. But they also have another language. And I think when I talk about having another language, it means they can understand a brief in another language. So maybe the client writes a brief in English. You need to be able to understand that. What's also important is that you can do research in a different language. So you might want to find out more about competitors or other companies that are similar, and it's very helpful to be able to do that in a different language. Or you're a translator. You have all those language skills, but you are also very, very good at writing. You know your own language really well and how to write in a way that is compelling. And one thing that both really focus on is their own language. And I think that's something that translators miss sometimes, because naturally, I think as translators, we're fascinated by different languages. It's something that we're passionate about, and we want to learn more and more. And it is very important as a translator to understand the other language really well. But as a trans creator, that's not the key, actually. So if you can understand the gist and capture sort of the message of that, then that's more important than really learning about the other language deeply. So yeah, the question is transcreation a skill that can be learned? I think from our experience, it's yes and no, because we've seen that in most cases, transcreation is something that some people just can do it and others cannot. It's a question of talent. But there are some things that you can learn to maybe improve a little bit or get into the transcreation world, I guess. And it will maybe help you elevate your skills a little bit. So let's take a look at some of those. All right, it might seem really obvious, but this is something that a lot of people miss. You need to know what you don't know before you get started. So translations, a lot of times you kind of get things that are, usually they're a little bit longer than transcriptions, and you can guess a lot of things in the context, or maybe a little bit of research, or you can kind of just smooth over things if you don't quite understand it, or if it's not quite clear from the source language. But transcreation really requires you to understand the intent and the details behind the words. So it's really important to ask the right questions. So it's things like, who is the target audience? This is super important, especially if you're working with languages where there's honorifics and different levels of politeness. And that's super important. What's the context? Is there an overarching campaign? Where is this going? If it's a print copy, or if it's digital, or where is this being used? That's really important to know. That leads to text limitations, so length and keywords and things like that. You want to ask about their brand. Maybe they only have like a style guide in one language, but if you can get that and kind of try and learn from that, that's usually very helpful. And what's super important is what we talk about, the intent. So what is this piece of copy trying to do? Are you trying to get more subscribers? Are you trying to actually just sell directly? Or is it just the brand awareness campaign? Those things really matter. So if this is kind of new to you, it might help to actually go out and learn a little bit more about marketing. And there's good books and blog posts and podcasts out there. But yeah, you should know what you don't know so that you can ask the right questions. And then once you know the information, then you can focus on the writing. And for that, you should really learn your own language. So this is something a lot of writers do, but it's really just reading a lot in your own language, keeping up with news and the media. I think that's something that we don't do often. Like if you live not in your country's how should I say it? Not in the language that is your native language, then maybe you want to subscribe to some newsletters or media from back home, keep up with trends. I actually try and read like the stupid ads that come up and banners and stuff and try and figure out what people are doing back in Japan or the US or the UK. Those things are really inspiring, actually, if you're actually sitting down to write copy. So, yeah, focus a little bit more on your own language. And then, of course, there's a few things that help. Some of these might be quite familiar to you. Like, a lot of German ads, they tend to focus more on, well, if you're taking a US ad and you're trying to transcreate it into German, you'll notice that the US ads are very excited. Like, it's a lot of, like, wowisms. And you want to maybe tone that down for German. They tend to seem to respond more to, like, features and information. Japanese, I know from experience, like, the simple pronouns like I and we, those are, like, super, super difficult to transcreate. You have to really know your audience to do that. So maybe it's worth just thinking more about that. Yeah. And then in practice, actually, we try and approach transcreation a little bit differently from how we set up translation projects at Supertext. So from far away, actually, it looks kind of the same. So you guys probably know the kind of process where you receive sort of a tool, a packaged up document. You open it up in Trados or your CAT tool. You send it back. Internally, we go through a proofreading process. We go through internal quality control. That kind of process might be quite similar. But actually, we try and change it a little bit so that transcreation, you can really focus more on the writing, or actually be a bit freer in terms of writing. So this is what it might look like in terms of a normal CAT tool, and of course, it's really important to use CAT tools even for transcreation, because maybe you do a slogan once and you don't want that to be translated differently the next time. So yeah, I think it's still important to use translation memories. But a line by line breakdown like this, it's actually quite unhelpful for the linguist, because that's how you end up translating. You do line by line. Is it creative? Probably not so much. Maybe segment 2 doesn't flow as nicely into segment 3 like that, or maybe segment 14 can be broken up into like 3 lines rather than 1. So what we try and do sometimes to solve this is to do paragraph-based segmentation. And so it will look more like this, and you'll be free to change the order around. You can Maybe there's some text that you don't think is necessary for that market. You don't need to include that line, or maybe you want to give a different version. So this just gives you more freedom to translate freely and more creatively. And then the other thing that we do is we do a lot of brainstorming. So this is our own copy, but we would maybe do one version with like 2 headline variations. We might actually invite a second person to come in and do the same thing. So you have different styles of writing that we can collaborate and do more refining and really try and find the best solution. When you're going through a process like this, you'll notice like sometimes it just comes to you, like it's instant. The first suggestion is just the best. And then other times it'll take like 30 suggestions before you feel like you've really nailed it. And what really helps is collaborating. So even with our linguists, we want to be working with you to get more ideas from you and then maybe ping you back, and it should be kind of a collaboration process. Sometimes it goes through our clients. We do that. So you might be working with our linguist team, but you might also be working with the client and getting more ideas and trying to really find the right message. And then the final thing, because with Transcreation, you're working with a lot of marketing teams. So it's not necessarily people that speak the second language. And so your job is kind of to sell your own copy. And one of the ways that we do that is something called a rationale. It's an explanation. It often includes a back translation, but also like an explanation of why this piece of copy is the best. So you might have things like information about how it relates to the audience, why were specific words chosen, are there other references that you could pull up? So maybe there were similar things in the past. It's a big part of what we do, actually, when we do transcreation projects, especially for things like slogans and titles. And actually, this is a good example because in the end, they decided to not translate and keep it in the original. And I think that's a really good example of what a transcreation should be. So the explanation is to keep it in the original title, and you just have to be able to justify why. So yeah, that's kind of the way we approach transcreation at Supertext. I think it's something that will become more and more in our business. It's a trend that we're seeing, especially from the US, where a lot of clients have big localization processes, but they recognize that some content really requires special attention. So yeah, just want to end with, see if this works, my favorite kind of transcreation. Yeah, this is just a really cool example, I think, of something that works really well in different languages. And yeah, I hope that you all are interested in transcreation and want to work with us on different projects. It's really rewarding because actually you will see your work on like billboards and websites and different places, and it's a really cool process to go through. So yeah, I hope we can work on different projects. Thank you.